So I'd argue that accessibility is probably more important than saving people from fires and stuff sometimes. I wish I had a really good fake American accent just to really confuse people, but I don't. So Zell's already covered it, but this is not me. I've not given up my acting career to become a developer. The money's not really the same. This is me, I'm not too sure. I always get asked about the guy who took this photo for me. This was done in a car park somewhere in Perth. It doesn't look anything like that when you see the original. Photoshop is good. Through my talk, I'll be referencing a couple of different URLs. To save you typing stuff madly, I've put them all on my Tumblr. So if you want to play along with a couple of demos that I'll be going through, note this down now and you can see exactly how bad my code is in the flesh, rather than the nice bits that I show you in my slides. I moved to Singapore a couple of years ago. I was working for this company. I'd just left them. One of the things I did when I shifted here is I took on the task of creating a global UI standard. The company I was working for, JLT, operate in 140-something countries around the world. We had teams just anywhere. We didn't even know how many teams there were working on software for us at any given time. And there was no coherence, anything from one to another. We had a logo that was the same. Most of the time the colors weren't. Any sense of UI was just lost, and branding was lost between the different divisions and outsourced companies and everything. So stupidly, I decided to do this myself. I had no actual support, really. I don't recommend doing that. Get help. I should note, actually, before I go further, I don't work at the company anymore. I don't know if anyone's actually maintaining this project. All the code is on GitHub, so you can grab it and look at it however you like, but no guarantees about how long it's going to be there. And I set out following the programmer's credo. We do things because we think they're easy, not because they are easy because we thought they were going to be easy. And classic avoidance behavior, the first thing I did setting out to create a UI style guide was to look into architecture, because that's exactly where you go. This piece of architecture is called the Strand. This was designed by Arthur Erickson, and it's in Robson Square in Vancouver. Erickson followed the design philosophies of the universal design. And the idea of universal design is that you build something and it's just inherently able to be used by everyone. So you've got a set of stairs. Where's the ramp? Well, the ramp is in the stairs. That's just how you do a ramp and how you do stairs. There's no special accordance made for anyone here. This is just good design. And the ideas of universal design are to make things equitable. So regardless of individual abilities, something will just work. You don't have to have legs in order to get up the ramp. It needs to be flexible. So irrespective of how someone wants to use it, it'll just work. William Gibson has a saying on this, like the street finds its own use for things. When we design a product that's good, anyone can pick it up and just use it the way they want to. They don't have to read a manual. It should just work in a way that makes sense. This is very difficult, of course, but this is what we aim towards. Design should be simple and intuitive. They should make sense without anyone having to explain what goes on. This is one of those things that's really easy to discuss, but it's really hard to do in practice because what makes sense to people changes over time. My son is 5 years old. If I give him a touch interface, he's got no problem with it. If I give a touch interface to someone, I mean, the first iPhone shipped with a manual because Apple weren't sure that people would know what to do with the thing. Now we think as touch and we talk about it as a really intuitive way of doing UI design. But there's nothing really inherently intuitive about anything. We just have to get into the social understanding of how people do things. So expectations will change over time, in essence. So what's simple and intuitive to us now wasn't for someone 100 years ago, for example, and won't be for someone 100 years from now. Design should be perceptible. If you can't see it, it's not there. Humans develop object permanence around 8 months. With young babies, you can do peekaboo, and that's really exciting because you've disappeared when your hands are in front of your eyes. Like, wow. With interfaces, it's exactly the same thing. If you can't see it, if you've got something that shows up only on hover, it's not there. Someone might find it by accident, but if that's content that someone needs to actually consume, then it's not going to be read. This is one of the big arguments against carousels, for example, because the rates for carousels, no one basically gets past the first slide, they don't read it. So when someone insists on a carousel, you say, are you happy that 98% of your viewers won't see anything past the first thing? If they are, that's fine. Let them pay the penalty. Design should be tolerant. And I've done a lot of work on forms in the past, and when you see videos of testing with forms and you see people crying because they get an error message, you understand the impact of what you're doing to people. Let people make mistakes. Let them fail in a way that's gentle. Don't let them just fall and cry, because that's what happens. So one of the problems in our industries is we never really see the people at the other end of the screen. But just keep that in your mind when you're doing it. Someone's going to have a great deal of difficulty with this unless I think about it a bit better. Design should be low effort. You shouldn't have to do gymnastics on the keyboard to do a keyboard shortcut. And if any Photoshop users with the export command, it's absolutely disgusting. And the guy who came up with it thought no one was going to use it, so you have to use a couple of hands, and I think your nose, just to get the key commands right. He's written a blog post apologising since, but if they thought about it a bit better, it might have been nicer. Design needs to be appropriate for the size and space, regardless of individual abilities. Having a 5-year-old and a boy, I'm acutely aware of how well designed urinals are in toilets, because you go into them, you get the ones that are really tall, and he can walk in there, there's no problem. You get the ones where the height is up here, I have to hold him so he can go, just a simple design of having it work for everyone. Adults can walk in, they use it, doesn't make a difference. Little boys can walk in and it's fine. When you don't use universal design, then you notice, basically. On a similar note, I wasn't really as appreciative as I could have been until I had a pram or a stroller. And when you've got wheels and you need to navigate through something, then you really appreciate how good ramps are and lifts and things like that. Otherwise, you'll just walk through life and not really notice that much until you hurt your foot or something. So setting out to build a framework, this tells you a lot about my own personality, but I went with no dependencies. I didn't want any history, any baggage, anything to hold me back. My rationale behind that is that I don't want to fail because someone else has written something bad that's going to break and I don't know what it does. I want to have some idea of what's actually going on. So the way to do that is pretty simple. You take Bootstrap, jQuery, all your different libraries, and throw them in the bin. I've got so many people who use Bootstrap, and I hate it, really. It's I'm taking my opportunity again to bag Bootstrap. There's nothing really in there that you can't do yourself. You just have to really have a go. The scariest thing out of this was throwing out jQuery. I've been writing JavaScript since it was released in 96, 97, whenever it was. I became a fully fledged jQuery friend or something along those lines. And you don't need it anymore. You've got element.querySelector and querySelector all. That's most of what jQuery does for you. You can live without it. Let go of the tethers and your life will be much happier. So the first thing setting out to create a library and following universal design was to make sure accessibility was a key. And that meant diving into the ARIA roles. I thought this was going to be a lot harder than it was. I had a pretty good idea of how ARIA things work because I care about that anyway. But creating this library, I wanted to make every single component of it completely accessible. No excuses. Every line of code, everything that's rendered must be accessible to everyone to the fullest possible standard. So that meant reading a lot of documentation. The good things out of this is it's changed how I code. So instead of, I've got my BEM syntax here, where I've got a tab and I've got my selected state. When you use the ARIA components, you don't need anything else. It actually gives you the syntax that makes a whole lot more sense in there. And it's easier to understand someone else's code when you're reading this. You can see right away, ARIA selected is true. You know what the state of that component is. It gives you a JavaScript selector. It gives you, or CSS, if you need to do anything with JavaScript. It does all the work for you. This is pretty awesome. And most of these things have just been sitting there and kind of get ignored a bit, but ARIA pays off really quickly. Even if you don't care about accessibility, just by following the standards, you get all these freebies, which is really nice. And then again, with setting attributes through JavaScript, it's really clear what this code does. You don't really need to explain to anyone what you're doing. You don't have to have a custom class or anything that someone needs to understand how your CSS works to work out how to set a selected state or some other state. When I first got into this, I got a bit crazy and did things like this. And don't do that. Is ARIA hidden, display none? It's like, yeah, if it's hidden, I don't want to show it on the screen, right? But then you want to animate something, and it's display none, so you can't do that anymore. So I quickly learnt to use like namespacing in essence, where you just attach it to a class that's already there. Then you've got the flexibility to do things how you want. I saw recently Hayden Pickering suggested one of the other ARIA pseudo classes or selectors. You do it in a universal, so ignore what I'm telling you in that regard. But generally speaking, just be careful when you're getting into this stuff. The first thing you'll want to do is really dive into the documentation. And if you've looked at W3C documentation, it's pretty scary. I mean, look how attractive this design is. It really wants you to read it. Fortunately, I'm not the first person to ever have done this. So I mentioned Hayden Pickering before. He's got some really awesome examples of UI components. You can just grab them exactly as they are and pop them into your projects if you like. Otherwise, read his code, work out how it operates, and it's really good. W3C documentation does have examples. Some of them are a bit wrong, which is why it's a good idea to go a bit further and find what you're doing. And the thing that you need to do is, you need tabs in a site. So just Google ARIA tabs and get your examples from that. It's not hard. Just add ARIA to your Google search and your life will be a whole lot easier. And everyone using your product will be happier as well. Leah is right here. This is her work. Thank you, Leah. I needed to create a hierarchical picker. We had some really complex data, and we needed a way for people to select things. We had basically really deep nested business units, parent company, local region, office locations in a city. It was just crazy trying to work it out. And the UIs that was there before I got onto the project were pretty horrendous. There were about 5 steps for anyone to get through to select something. So I grabbed AwesomePlete, which is as awesome as the name suggests. I mean, it's 2K and you've got a fully accessible, use this thing, everyone. You don't need Bootstrap when you've got this. It's just, So this is my code. I was going to do a live demo, but for some reason Keynote hates me at the moment, so I'm just doing the slide version instead. This is a hierarchical picker that when you start typing, it will select things for you. The structure is taking a tree view from the ARIA recommendations, so all the accessibility of a tree view, nested in with the recommendations of how a autocomplete works. So when you have custom controls, you don't have to just say, well, it's not in the ARIA spec, and who needs accessibility? Just chop and change what's in there, and it makes sense after a while. It's not too hard to wrap your head around it. So the idea of this one is you can very quickly select what you want and then navigate down the tree without having to know what it's doing. If you don't want to type, you can still navigate through the tree because it's a fully accessible tree view. So you get both things at once, which is great. This is a demo, so it doesn't look pretty. Never went to production because I left the company before anything happened with it. But the code is there. This thing does work. You can't read that. I can't read that. This is a huge screen, so my example's a little bit lost, but you're meant to have read it by now. One of the keys, like ARIA roles are only part of accessibility. Making things obvious is really important. Accessibility we talk about usually in a very narrow range, where we say that here's your ARIA stuff, you follow the, add the attributes and you're done. But it's not just that. And this is really going back to universal design, making things intuitive that you can actually work out what you're doing. So the universal design principles here are simple and intuitive, perceptible, low effort, right size and space, and that's wrapped up as make it obvious. This is Google's recommendation for touch sizing, and this is really what you need to know about buttons and interactive elements, basically. You need to make them big enough. Before touch screens became a thing, usually we worried about something that you could generally reach with a mouse. With touch, we've got these things which are really clumsy at UI interaction. And the research has been done that we know that based on a certain pixel measure, you can make something big enough that I can tap it with my finger without having to be worried about it. People use this in dark patterns, or I don't know if they're actually intentionally being evil or if they're just ignorant, but you'll see pop-up ads on mobile where it's got a tiny little X and it makes you actually click on the ad instead. But if you love your users, and you do, because you're here at CSSConf, Apple and Google recommend a minimum 24 pixels for an interaction target, so 24 by 24. Microsoft recommend 26. Pick one, go with it, and at least things will be better. When you're getting into really tight UIs, and even on desktop, this makes things easier. If you're using a mouse, it's easier to click on the thing. Regardless of how you're interacting with your device, making elements or interactive elements larger makes them better. Color contrasts you usually see as an Ishihara plate when you get your eyes tested when you're younger, or something like you might encounter color blindness. And the whole point of an Ishihara plate is some colors don't really gel very well with each other, and contrasts don't work very well. Really, the cure, like when you read into how color blindness affects people, the way to fix it is to ensure that the elements have enough contrast from each other so that irrespective of being able to perceive the colors, you can still tell the difference. So anyone who's colorblind along the wrong spectrum, or right spectrum, will have trouble reading this. This is hard to read anyway, even if you do have perfect color vision, because the contrast is intentionally difficult. Fortunately, Get and the W3C have done the work for us. They recommend contrast ratios of 4:1, or 4.5 to 1 for small text, less than 20 points, and 3 to 1 for anything from 20 and up. So that's great, you know what to do. The problem is how to actually test for it. The good thing is there are some really good browser plugins. This is the one in Firefox. This is the WCAG contrast checker. I have it Alt-C. I hit and it just comes up and you can test things really quickly. Fortunately, the W3C site passes the contrast checker, partly because their design is so bland that, you'd hope it does. You can see up here that the contrast ratios are there, the luminosity. So it shows you exactly what passes and what fails. It gets a bit more complex when you're dealing with background images, and most checkers don't do this very well. Because when you have a variable background, you need to basically measure every part of it. This site actually lets you do it. So you can put an image in there, you can put the text on top, and it'll tell you whether or not it is going to pass or not. The difficult thing is when you're first starting out doing color contrast properly, is getting into the rhythm of it, because designers don't have very good tools for actually measuring contrast. So what you really need to do is talk to your designers frequently. When they give you something, test it out and see, and talk to them and show them and work out what the answer is going to be. Once you get used to how contrasts work, you'll be able to see what is a good contrast or not without having to do a test. I mean, you still test anyway to confirm, but when you get into the habit of it, it becomes much easier. It's certainly difficult at first, and especially so for designers, because the tools are just lacking. But color contrast is more complex than that. This is a blog post from Ryan Frederick at Shopify. And they started looking at the ratios, and they're fixed ratios. And humans are not robots. We're organic creatures. We see the green spectrum particularly well. We perceive other colors better or worse according to what we're designed to do in nature. And that means you get things like this, where we've got a failure over on the left and a success over on the right, yet perceptively, the one on the left is probably a little, that's your right anyway. The white text is somewhat better to read in certain circumstances. So the algorithm itself is not quite enough. Like, the simplicity of what the W3C are doing isn't necessarily perfect. And the Shopify team looked into this further, and they found a 1992 highway manual talking about the legibility of signage. And they've done the research. There's maths. I'm sorry to introduce maths in the morning. But this actually shows that the white on red is more perceptible for human interaction, basically, than the black on red, even though it's the other way around when you use a simple formula. So if you're getting into this and you're really sure that your color looks good, even though the W3C tool tells you otherwise, then dive a bit deeper and you can come up with some really interesting designs. Buttons annoy me greatly. When iOS 7 came around, everything went flat, and flat meant that we don't know what we're clicking on or interacting with anymore. Google followed suit with Material a few years later, and we've got our 3 buttons. Like, this one's all right. The middle one, you can see it's buttony. The one on the end, what is that? That's just text on the screen. How am I meant to know whether I'm meant to interact with that or not? I'm just going to leave that alone and not touch it because it might do something bad. This is a really, really bad trend. And we frequently follow, like humans are pack animals, we follow everyone else's example of what to do. Google writes something, Apple writes something, we just do exactly what they do without question. But this is not good because there's nothing inviting about that button. There's nothing to tell me to make it obvious. You can get context within positioning on the screen, and certain habits will form, but there's nothing inherently buttony about it. Fortunately, with a lot of open source style guides lately, we've got some really good examples of what to do. The really basic level is you need some outline around the target so I know how big the thing is. Am I going to tap over here or there or where? When you've got a border, you know exactly what you're in for. It makes it much easier to interact with something. This is from the US government web design standards. I haven't looked at the site since Trump was passed, so it's probably all in flames at the moment, I don't know. There are lots of good examples of what to do with buttons out there. Keyboard access. This is something that gets neglected quite a lot because it requires some effort. Fortunately, the effort's not that much. Usually for keyboard access of UI controls, you need tab, enter, and the arrow keys, or space as well. You don't really need to do all that much. And once you've written it for one control, you can copy those patterns and use it in a library and reuse that everywhere else as well. Fortunately, we live in a world where everyone shares everything. Remy Sharp has done the work for you. So I thought, tabs, how hard can tabs be? Tabs can be very hard. So Remy wrote this article, how tabs should work. When I looked through it, it didn't quite do everything that I wanted to, so I grabbed his code and modified it. I've got a blog post that says how tabs should really work, but I'm not Remy Sharp, so you haven't read it before. This is my code example of the tabs that I wrote. Again, this is demo. So here we are at CSSConf, and most CSS is minimal. It's really bad. I've basically done enough to show how things are interoperable here and no further than that. So this is when the page first loads. Some tabs you'll see can't handle multiple sets of tabs on the screen. It's like, oh, come on, learn how to use JavaScript properly. So here I've selected the second tab. I've now got focus on the second tab. My contrast is really bad, I'm sorry, so you probably can't see that very well. So this is where the keyboard nav basically kicks in. And then I can use arrow keys from there to navigate between tabs, which is really good. So we'll pause and reflect with the kitten for a moment. Because up to here, you've basically done everything, which is great. But once you've reached this point, you need to think that little bit further, which is to make sure you don't mess with the environment that you're in. When we're writing things that are custom, if you're using a form control like a select, it's built into the browser, the behaviors are known. When you write something on your own, then you need to bring it up to that standard or don't ship it. And that means you need to respect everything that the browser does. What you need to do is be able to go backward and forward in the browser without things stuffing up. I should be able to hit a hash somewhere in the URL without it breaking Angular or any JavaScript libraries. Angular is bad. Even React did this early on, where if you have 2 hashes in the URL, it kills the framework, which stops the rendering. They've fixed it. Angular's kind of catching up, but anyway. You need to be able to refresh the page, and the tab I selected last time is still selected. Like, why can't these things just be done? But it's not that hard. Most of how this works is, like in this particular instance, you can refresh it and the tab stays there. There's an API for that. It's the storage API that's been there for a while. No one really knows about it, but it takes care of a lot of the problems that we usually have with remembering things. Filling out a form, you get an error, it reloads the page, and everything you've filled out is gone because no one knows how to do this. But storage lets you do all of that on the client side without a problem. It's really, really powerful. But the essence of it is to make sure you don't kill what's already there. You maintain the standards of what things should do. And it's not good enough to say that, oh, I know everyone's going to have JavaScript turned on, so, it's all going to be fine. All my users have got perfect vision. I've asked them. It's all right. You need to actually think that little bit further, and it's really what universal design is about, is building things for everyone anyway, because that's just the better way of doing things. A lot of accessibility talks use a lot of stick, where they're just telling you you're a bad person if you don't do this thing. I'm trying to give you a carrot here to make you feel better about just making your code better. The fact that it's accessible and people get to use it is a bonus. It's just a better quality product that you'll be producing. And universal design has gone into other fields. This is a whole range of prototype peelers and the finished products that were the first product from Oxo. And Sam Farber, the founder, noticed that his wife, who was quite arthritic, had trouble using a kitchen peeler. And it was like, well, that's not good. went to the shop and there was nothing he could find that did the job. So he iterated through several designs and got her to test it out. And this is designed only for his wife. I've got OXO products at home. I had no idea about this until I actually looked into it. I just thought they were really well designed. And that's the essence of what this is about. Making your products fit into the philosophies of universal design will make a better product inherently, even for people who don't have any special needs. So go forth with your inspiration that you too can create a better kitchen peeler, regardless of how strange your UI might be. And your work will be a whole lot better. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Chris. That was an amazing talk on web accessibility. So do any of you have any questions for Chris? Zell will be giving out the microphone. Please raise your hand.
Does anyone want to know about kitchen peelers?
Yeah, the highway signs thing you had with
I'll leave it on for a little bit.
The contrast levels, what were the numbers being used in that? Was it because you were using some color numbering system that I wasn't familiar with? So maybe I can talk to you about it after that, but if you could share a bit more about it, that would be helpful.
Yeah, it's on the Shopify article, actually linked to that highway manual. I can jump back in the slides. No, I can't jump back through the slides. There we go. I can't actually remember the intent behind this. Because the highway manual is quite detailed into reflection of surfaces and different things like that they take into account. But the whole point of this is it's not just as simple as a straightforward color contrast.
Right. Thank you.
Anyone has any more questions for Chris? Anyone?
What color should your kitchen peeler be?
All right, then. Thank you so much, Chris. Can you please give another round of applause for Chris? Thank you.